so much, Saad, and it's really wonderful to be a part of this particular discussion, specifically under the mentorship of Dr. Shoaib Pervez, who really encourages critical discussion and argumentation to a higher plane. So let's set the stage before we begin to the lines of inquisition that we will have prospectively. So I'd like to restrict my debate to five levels, which I believe are very crucial in understanding the conflict itself. So the first is identification of a conflict. So over the years, we've heard quite a few names: Kashmir issue, Kashmir conflict, Kashmir crisis, Kashmir wars, and each one of these words has some significance associated to it, not only theoretically but also practically when it comes to policy decision making. So when you look at Kashmir, how do you look at it? Is it a crisis between two nations? Is it a conflict of sorts between two nations, specifically when it comes to ascertainment of existential nature, considering that geostrategic value based on territorial incongruity is the one conflict that we do have, or the nuclear flashpoint that Pakistan and India continuously talk about? Is it an issue between two states that can be resolved through bilateral, multilateral, or trilateral discourses? So that's one aspect that I would like to have a discussion on. The second aspect is diplomatic. So when you're looking at whatever issue, crisis, or conflict you're looking at, you're also supposed to look at the solution associated to it. So if it is a conflict, you're supposed to know what triggers it. If it is a crisis, you're supposed to know what are the escalation points and what are the de-escalation motions. If you're calling it an issue, you're supposed to understand what each party to this issue holds as their point of view, and then you bring them to the diplomatic table, and then you sit down and then you have a conversation. So that's the second point. Where do we look at Kashmir when we look at it diplomatically? The third aspect is security. So when we talk about Kashmir as a strategic jugular vein, when India calls it an existential territorial crisis between Pakistan and India, the Atut narrative, and then you have a nuclear policy associated to it, you have a military displacement pattern associated to it, you have a deployment scheme associated to it, you have two nations entering into military operations, surgical of nature or non-surgical, full-fledged. So you're looking at a deployment structure of two militaries, you're looking at confrontation between two militaries, engagement between two militaries. So that is the strategic angle. Then there is a fourth angle, the deterrence angle. Now this is where my specialty or my area of interest comes into play. When you're looking at some particular notion or some particular place as a place where nuclear deterrence can actually have a meltdown, you're supposed to be very crucial on it. So, do we compare Kashmir to a Cuban Missile Crisis? Do we compare Pakistan's military deployment and strategic posturing towards Kashmir as the Able Archer 1983 by the Europeans against the Soviet Union? Do we call it a Vietnam? Do we call it a Korea of South Asia? Whatever we identify, as far as the deterrence dynamics are concerned, is what is going to be the future discourse of states. And the fifth angle, which Graham Allison really talks in extensive detail in his book, The Crisis and Essence of Decision Making, is that where do you associate the responsibility? Now we understand Kashmir is a problem, issue, conflict, crisis, whatever you may like to call it. We do understand that there are some forces involved. Some are responsible for escalating the conflict, some are responsible for mitigating, some are responsible for consolidation. We do understand that there are stakeholders, there are grassroots stakeholders, there are primary level stakeholders, there are secondary level stakeholders, there are tertiary level stakeholders. We do understand that there is something involved in it. Some things are existential, actual national interest. Some things are non-existential. They are perceived national interest or threat perceptions. So there's a mix in that. But in this fifth plane, which becomes the more crucial subject of our discussion, who takes the responsibility? When you look at Kashmir as a crisis, who is responsible for the escalation? Who is responsible for de-escalation? We've talked about third-party intervention in Pakistan and India all our lives. Whenever we look at the disputes between Pakistan and India, if it is 1965, we see that there was third-party mediation in Tashkent. When we look at 1971, we do not discount third-party intervention in that particular issue. When we look at the crises on Siachen from 1982 up until 1987, we look at that, yes, America and Soviet Union in one capacity or China in the other had some role to play. When we look at the incidents that occurred in the 90s, we again look at third party mediation. We've never talked bilateral because we think bilateral discussions are not that important, because we think we are not bureaucratically responsible for the problem. So now these five things are assigned. Let's dissect South Asia, and I'll take a very few minutes into that. Let's take a couple of minutes so we get these things into perspective. So when you look at South Asia, you're looking at a territory which we believe has been divided between two nations very hurriedly. So the sentiment is that the dispute between Pakistan and India is of an incomplete partition. The association of this particular conundrum, the word incomplete partition, is also something that we will be using on 16th December 1971 too, but let's not just get into that debate right now. We believe that the colonizers that were here to rule didn't do us justice for the fact that once they were dividing territories between two ethnic groups, that's what the term the British used, they ignored the religiosity of it, the religion part. And despite the fact that there were two ethnic groups that belonged in this particular territory, there were multiple more, but two major. The religiosity part was something that was missed. So when they came to princely states, they were a bit too arbitrary. So you can divide the princely states as per the wishes and whims of the princely states, but this required a little bit of interpretation. The interpretation would have been, do the wishes and whims come from the seat of office of authority of a princely state, or do they come from the masses? So if there is a princely state where the masses want to go in one direction and the seat of authority wants to go in the other, which particular dimension do you choose? So that's the first unjust that was done to South Asia. And then whatever follows is what we term in South Asia as a domino effect. Now that this partition is incomplete and the arbitrariness is visible, whatever is happening arbitrarily. So whoever is able to institute their right more aggressively, more tangibly, is the one that controls the territorial claim in possession, not in ownership. So you can change the ownership when you amend your constitution. That is where India in 1949 designs a constitution and starts incorporating certain princely states into the mix. That's where the first controversy comes up. That if the people of a territory want to go one direction and the authority board wants to go to the other, where do you choose? And who's the interlocutor? So that's the first failure where we believe, both India and Pakistan, New Delhi and Islamabad, where we collectively believe that it was never our responsibility to begin with. Since this independence was something that was being installed, if that is the more appropriate word, if I may put it decently, since they are the interlocutors, they are responsible for a comprehensive settlement of the issue. Now, if they're unable to do that, that's not my problem. Fast forward it to the Kargil crisis, we believe that this particular role of third party mediation is the only way you can bring Pakistan and India on table. So when you talk about Kashmir, you're not talking about territoriality as such, you're not talking about the human rights violations as such, you're not talking about the resources that we claim that are there, which are crucial for the survival of both states as such. We're talking about the failure of the international community to mediate and act as an interlocutor. Now, this being the frame of South Asia, does that absolve us of the responsibility of crisis management and crisis mitigation in our region? That's where we come to the Simla Agreement, because that could be termed as the first crucial diplomatic document between two states which we believe was unguided by a third party mediator. Now, there may be several claims that it was mediated by third party pressure, where Soviet Union exerted pressure on the Indians and Americans exerted pressure on the Pakistanis to come to settlement. But generally speaking, when we talk about the lingua franca of the Simla Agreement, we believe that it was something that was pretty much done by the Indians and the Pakistanis in isolation. And that brings you to the controversy in Kashmir. Now, India claims that reciprocity in the Simla Agreement is understood. So, if there is any issue in the Kashmir crisis, it has to be dealt bilaterally, not multilaterally. But then, when you look at Pakistan and the bureaucratic decision making structure inside the Pakistani territory in that particular phase, it's that we would not like to take responsibility of a failure that has repeated itself over time, and we would like some other bureaucracy to take responsibility. And that is where Pakistan starts saying that it cannot be applied on reciprocity because Simla Agreement does not talk about reciprocity to begin with. So the document that we refer to is the resolutions that were forwarded by the United Nations Security Council on the settlement of the issue. So we believe that the issue has already been dealt with, the modalities have already been settled, and the implementation is where India is not compromising or complying or cooperating. Now you have a diplomatic flux between the two states. This is where the hydrus becomes interesting. Up until 1972 till 1993, Pakistan and India are constantly debating as to which bureaucracy holds responsibility for which course of action. And this is where a crisis can become a conflict, and a conflict can be escalated to a full blown war. So we have a few adventures in between up until Kargil, and then we realize that there are some mistakes that we need to correct. So I leave this podium with three mistakes that I believe that exist in South Asia, and then we can always go into the line of inquisition and explain more. So the first mistake: who is responsible for the unsettled, and I may use the word again freely, the incomplete partition of South Asia? Because that is where all the issues will start to culminate. The second mistake question: which bureaucratic process in Pakistan and India is responsible for taking the head charge, the spearhead, the bulwark, for the settlement of crises between two states? And the third, what is the blueprint, the sketch, or the schematic of conflict mediation and crisis de escalation of South Asia? So once we take these three questions on to the public, we are free to evolve these questions into whatever concerns you have. You can take a stakeholder analysis, you can take a state analysis, you can take a body analysis, you can take a national security analysis, you can take an internal view and external view, evolve these into questions, launch it at the panel, and we'll be sure to answer your questions and concerns. Thank you so much.
Dr. Shoaib, who has work revolving around identity, that how the superimposed identities of the elites of Pakistan and India destroyed the socio-cultural fabric of the Kashmir and their distinct identity. So I would request Dr. Shoaib to continue.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Saad, and truly honored by the presence of Dr. Sharreh Qazi. Punjab University is really fortunate to have his mind in political science department. MashaAllah, he spoke very well. And again, I'm equally thankful to our worthy colleague, Professor of Practice. Really good to have served with us, because that's how we really can make a difference in academia, to having the practitioner point of view alongside academic, and to give you the right flavor for your academics here at UMG. So thank you, sir. So coming back to Saad, I will not take much of your time because Dr. Sharreh has very nicely articulated the five perspective or the parameters through which we can understand this complicated issue. So I'm really thankful to you, sir. So coming back to the pertinent question and the part of my thesis also in PhD, I studied this dispute again. When you are in an academia. So the first question of my supervisor was that I know what's coming from a Pakistani towards India. So that will be your test. So how long you can close your Pakistani eye and you can be open to objectivity and the evidence and the rigors of doing a PhD. And that can, mind you, student, my children, that can only be possible in a foreign environment. Sorry to say that. Because we are so much charged up. We are so much charged up here in Pakistan as well as in India, that to have an objectivity, to have a quest for your data, to go through meticulously the archival research, availability is a problem, objectivity is a big problem, and then the write-up and going through the peer review stages, which Professor Javesa was very articulate, that you go through peer review stages, and that's how your things do not get accepted if you don't write anti-Pakistani things. But anyways, that's beyond the point. So coming back to Kashmir issue, as Saad has posed the question, so what I come across while I was digging out the data is that My argument in that chapter was Kashmir issue has embroiled in the identity tussle of India and Pakistan. And interestingly, Kashmiris have their own unique identity based on Kashmiri art. And that identity is very much different from the people of rest of the subcontinent. For example, in Kashmir, the Hindus and the Muslims and the Buddhists, the three demographic areas inhabited by these three nationalities, sub-nationalities, they do not fight with each other all along. I dig out the history, 1,000 year history back. Islam was spread much more peacefully, without any sword, without any disturbance. So the number one thing is their religious traditions are unique as compared to the rest of the subcontinent. There was no violence between the Hindus and the Muslims, as we see even during the freedom struggle. It remained relatively much more peaceful. And they have their unique socio-cultural identity. And that identity was trespassed by both Pakistanis and the Indians. Indians, they want Kashmir to be the jewel of their secularist crown, and that crown is again no more in the garb of Hindutva, that has changed, but still they want to have the Muslim majority princely state under their constitution. And similarly, Pakistan want to have its Islamic credential fulfilled, its Islamic identity fulfilled through acquisition of Kashmir. And the way we practice Islam, you all know over here. Practicing here something and going to UFD Green is another thing. So I need not to discuss that. So how much Islamic we are, we all know. So the third important aspect was, apart from their Rishi tradition, the religious tradition, is their quest for having an autonomy, quest for having an independent nation. And again, there, the indigenous people who have written, the people belonging to Kashmir, time and again they talk about this because they have been under four dynasties ruled by the Mughal, by the Afghan, by the Sikhs, and by the Dogras. So long history of under subjugation. Unfortunately, in the Pakistani state narrative, we do not have any space for Kashmiriya or the Kashmiri identity discourse. Similarly, unfortunately, for the Indians, they don't have that space either. But even if we say that thing is gone, now gone, and that complexities have changed, it has become much more complex. Now talk about the practices of the Indians towards Kashmir and practices of Pakistanis towards Kashmir. We have Gilgit-Baltistan as a separate province, the disputed territory. Nobody talks about it. We have that even UN resolution, the number one point is Pakistan should demilitarize, should go back. Nobody talked about the clause number one. They talk about two and three. Two ask for that India should keep its forces to the minimum, which is required for law and order. And third is the plebiscite. What about the first one? We don't have any debate, right? So, and last but not the least, I will finish up over here. We have used all avenues on Kashmir. We have used, we went in 1948, 47, 48, we went inside the territory in 1961. Not a single Kashmiri stood with our armed forces in 1965. That's again documented. I was also stunned, I was shocked. I was going through the literature and it was categorical that no Kashmiri stood in 1965 war with us. Fast forwarded, and there was time in the 1980s when there was a big advertisement in all newspapers that giving sadqa and kharat to this organization is an swabidaran. Give charity to this. Come out. You have to fight for the cause. Now the same organization, again headed by the same person, is persona non grata for the Pakistani establishment because of FATF, Financial Action Task Force. The organization is there. We propped it up. We used it up. We want to cut India into 1,000 pieces. Why are we not funding it? So the third and the last point is we lack a national narrative on Kashmir all across. Everybody has his vested and parochial interest. Everybody played with this toy, and it has been defamed, it has been defaced beyond recognition. So I leave it over here and thank you very much.